The Badlands outside Outpost Dre 9 smelled like burnt metal and old dust, and that was exactly why Daniel Reyes loved them. Rich men did not walk through wreckage looking for scrap. Only poor men did that, and Daniel had been poor his whole life. He did not mind it much. He had learned how to survive on very little, and today he was looking for anything he could sell, fix, or trade. His boots crunched over broken glass and rusted pipes. Behind him, a small drone floated low to the ground, its lights flickering weakly. The drone's name was Rusty, and it was almost as poor and broken as Daniel himself. One of its arms was held together with tape. Its scanner beeped every few seconds, searching for anything valuable buried in the dirt. "Found something?" Daniel asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Rusty beeped twice, which meant yes. They walked further into the wreckage until they found it. It was not old junk from the colony. It was something else entirely. A large pod, black and scorched, half buried in the sand. It did not belong to any ship Daniel had ever seen before. Its surface was smooth, almost like scales, and a faint light still pulsed weakly near one end. Daniel's heart beat faster. A pod like this could be worth a lot of money if he sold the parts, maybe enough to fix his roof or buy real food instead of ration packs. He knelt down and began clearing the sand away with his hands. Inside, hidden in a soft nest of shredded cloth, were 3 eggs. They were each about the size of his 2 fists together, with hard shells that shimmered faintly, like they were made of dark glass, with tiny cracks of gold running through them. They were warm to the touch, even though the pod around them was cold and broken. Daniel sat back on his heels and stared at them for a long moment. He knew somehow that these were not ordinary eggs. He also knew there was no mother nearby. The pod's outer shell was torn open, and dark stains marked the metal near the entrance. Whatever had carried these eggs here had not survived the crash. He could sell them. Egg collectors from other colonies paid well for strange finds like this. It would be the smartest thing to do. His stomach growled, as if reminding him how empty his pantry was at home. Instead, Daniel reached into the nest and gently lifted the eggs into his worn cloth bag, one at a time. "They're still warm," he said quietly to Rusty. "I can't just leave them out here to go cold." Rusty beeped a soft, worried sound, but followed him anyway as Daniel carried the eggs back toward the colony. His home was small, a single room built from old shipping containers welded together at the edge of Outpost Dre 9. The walls were patched in places where the metal had rusted through. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, flickering when the power dipped low, which happened often. There was one narrow cot, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a small heater that barely worked. Daniel placed the 3 eggs carefully on a folded blanket near the heater, the warmest spot in the room. He sat beside them for hours that night, unable to sleep, watching the golden cracks in their shells glow faintly in the dim light. Just past midnight, the first egg began to shake. Daniel jumped back in surprise as a small crack spread across the shell, then another crack, and another. Within minutes, all 3 eggs were rocking gently, tiny sounds coming from inside them, like something scratching to get out. He watched, frozen, as the first shell finally broke open. A small, wet creature tumbled out onto the blanket, blinking large eyes up at him. It had short wings still folded against its body, small horns just beginning to form on its head, and scales that shimmered a deep red in the lamplight. It looked nothing like any animal Daniel had ever seen. It looked, without question, like a dragon. The second egg cracked open soon after, revealing a smaller hatchling with blue-green scales and bright, curious eyes that immediately fixed on Daniel's face. The third egg took longer, and when it finally opened, the smallest hatchling of the 3 peeked out shyly, golden scales catching the light, before slowly crawling toward the warmth of the heater. All 3 hatchlings turned their heads toward Daniel at the same time. He held his breath, unsure what to do. Then, one by one, they began to crawl toward him instead of away, climbing clumsily into his lap, pressing close against his chest for warmth. Daniel looked around his small, cramped room, the patched walls, the flickering lamp, the half-broken heater. To him, it was barely enough to survive in. But the hatchlings nestled against him, looking around at the warm light, the soft blanket, and the strange metal shelter that had kept them safe. And something in their small minds decided this human, whoever he was, must be the richest, safest creature they had ever known. They did not know about empty pantries or unpaid bills. They only knew that they were warm, they were fed with whatever soft food Daniel offered them, and they were, for the first time since hatching, completely safe. Daniel sighed, looking down at the 3 small dragons curled against him. "I don't even have enough credits to fix my own roof," he muttered, "and now I've got 3 of you to feed." The red one gave a happy little chirp, nuzzling closer, as if Daniel had just promised them a palace. Outside, the wind of Outpost Dre 9 howled quietly over the scrapyards, and somewhere far beyond the colony's shield, in places Daniel could not yet imagine, others had already begun to notice that something valuable had been born that night. 3 weeks after the hatching, Daniel's small room looked like a storm had passed through it twice. Blankets were shredded into makeshift nests. Scratch marks covered the lower half of one wall. And a strange smell of burnt fabric hung in the air, thanks to a small accident involving the red hatchling's first attempt at breathing fire. He had named them without really meaning to. The bold red one, always first to jump, first to bite, first to get into trouble, became Rocky. The clever blue-green one, who watched everything with sharp, curious eyes and figured out how to open the food container within 2 days, became Sunny. And the shy golden one, who preferred hiding behind Daniel's legs and only came out when she felt safe, became Willow. "Rocky, get down from there," Daniel said, staring up at the small dragon perched on top of his one working shelf, chewing on a piece of wire like it was the finest treat in the galaxy. Rocky chirped happily and did not move. Sunny, meanwhile, had discovered how to slide open the storage container where Daniel kept his tools, and was carefully inspecting each item with great interest, occasionally tapping one against the floor to test if it made an interesting sound. Willow sat quietly near the heater, watching her siblings with wide eyes, occasionally letting out a small huff of smoke when she got excited. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. He had not slept properly in days. Feeding 3 growing hatchlings on a scavenger's income was proving far harder than he expected. His usual ration packs disappeared in a single meal now. He had already sold his spare jacket and an old set of tools just to buy more food. And yet, every single day, the 3 of them looked at him like he had given them the greatest gift in the universe. That morning, Rusty the drone floated in through the door, chirping in its usual worried tone. Daniel had sent it out to search for extra scrap he could sell, but Rusty returned mostly empty, just a few bent metal rods and a cracked circuit board. "Not much today," Daniel sighed, taking the small pile from Rusty's claw. "It's fine, we'll manage." Rocky bounded over immediately, sniffing the pile of scrap with great interest, before letting out a small proud huff, as though Daniel had just brought home a mountain of gold. That was the strange part. No matter how little Daniel had, the 3 hatchlings treated it like a fortune. When he gave them plain protein paste for dinner, they ate it like it was a feast. When he patched a hole in the wall with a piece of old metal sheeting, they treated the room like a brand new addition to their home. Even Rusty, dented and slow, was treated by the hatchlings like a mighty guardian beast, something to be admired and protected. Daniel didn't understand it, not fully, but he had a growing suspicion. He decided to visit the colony's trading post, hoping to find some answers and maybe trade a few things for more food. The trading post was run by a woman named Grace Ockafer, sharp-eyed and quick, with both words and numbers. She had known Daniel for years, ever since he first arrived at Outpost Dre 9 with barely more than the clothes on his back. "You look terrible," Grace said the moment he walked in. "Thanks," Daniel muttered, setting a small bag of scrap on her counter. Grace glanced at it, then at him, her eyes narrowing. "You've been feeding something bigger than yourself, haven't you? I heard noises coming from your place. Chirping, growling. My neighbor swears she saw smoke coming out of your vents last week." Daniel hesitated, but there was no point lying to Grace. He told her everything: the crashed pod, the eggs, the hatching, and the three small dragons currently probably destroying what little furniture he had left back home. Grace's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Dragonkin," she said slowly. "Daniel, do you have any idea what those are? They're not just some rare animal. They're an ancient spacefaring species, respected, powerful, and extremely valuable to the wrong kind of people." "I figured they were special," Daniel admitted. "I didn't think." "You need to register them with Colony Authority," Grace said, cutting him off. "Officially, otherwise you're just an unlicensed human raising unregistered alien creatures, and that's the kind of thing that gets attention, bad attention." Daniel's stomach sank. Registration meant paperwork, fees, inspections, things that cost money he simply did not have. "I can't afford that," he said quietly. Grace studied him for a long moment, then sighed and reached under her counter, pulling out a small data pad. "I'll help you figure something out, but Daniel, listen to me carefully. If people learn there are 3 young dragonkin living with a scavenger who barely has 2 credits to his name, some of them won't come asking nicely. Some of them will just try to take what they want." Daniel thought of Rocky, Sunny, and Willow curled up together back home, trusting him completely, believing without question that he was the richest, safest guardian in the galaxy. He did not feel rich, he felt scared. "I'll figure it out," he said, more to convince himself than Grace. As he walked back home that evening, bag of traded supplies slung over his shoulder, Daniel did not notice the stranger standing near the edge of the market, watching him closely. The stranger wore a long grey coat, unfamiliar to the colony, and spoke quietly into a small communicator clipped to his collar. "Confirmed," the stranger said. "Dragonkin hatchlings, 3 of them, located at the Eastern Scrap District, sending coordinates now." He slipped the communicator back into his pocket and continued watching Daniel's small home from a distance, patient, calculating, and very far from poor. 2 months passed, and the 3 hatchlings were no longer small enough to fit comfortably in Daniel's lap. Rocky had grown almost to the size of a large dog, his red scales now hard and gleaming, small horns curling back from his head. Sunny had grown nearly as large, her blue-green scales patterned with faint stripes, her eyes always scanning the room for something new to investigate. Willow, though still the smallest, had grown too, her golden scales catching light beautifully whenever she stepped into the sun. Feeding them had become a full-time struggle. Daniel now spent nearly every waking hour searching for scrap, taking on riskier jobs than before, climbing into unstable wreckage further and further from the colony's shielded zone, where automated defense systems from old wars sometimes still activated without warning. One afternoon, deep in a collapsed cargo hauler, Daniel's foot slipped through a weak section of the floor. He caught himself just in time, heart pounding, dangling half over a drop that could have easily broken his leg or worse. Rusty hovered nearby, beeping frantically, unable to help pull him up. He climbed out slowly, hands shaking, and sat on a piece of twisted metal to catch his breath. "This is insane," he muttered to himself. "I'm risking my neck for scrap that barely covers a week of food." But when he returned home that evening, exhausted and covered in dust, the 3 dragons rushed to greet him like he had returned from some great and glorious victory. Rocky nudged a small pile of shiny bolts toward him, clearly proud of having found them somewhere in the room. Sunny had rearranged half of Daniel's tools into a strange but oddly practical order. Willow, shy as ever, simply pressed close against his side, humming softly, a sound Daniel had come to recognize as her way of showing comfort. He sank down onto the floor beside them, too tired to even reach the cot. "You 3 have no idea how close I am to broke," he said quietly, mostly to himself. Rocky chirped happily in response, completely misunderstanding the tone, and gently placed one more bolt on the small pile, as if adding to a treasure hoard. Daniel let out a tired laugh despite himself. "Yeah, sure, very rich, practically royalty." The next day he visited Grace again, this time not for parts, but because he genuinely did not know how much longer he could keep this up. His savings, small as they were, had run completely dry. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days, giving most of his food to the growing hatchlings instead. Grace took one look at him and pulled him inside without a word, setting a bowl of hot food in front of him before he could protest. "Eat," she said firmly. "You look like a ghost." Daniel didn't argue. As he ate, Grace studied him carefully. "You're not going to give them up, are you, even though it's clearly killing you?" "No," Daniel said simply, without hesitation. Grace sighed, though it wasn't an unkind sound. "I figured. Look, I've been asking around. The Colony Trade Council offers credit extensions to registered guardians of protected species, but you need at least basic registration paperwork filed first, which still costs a small fee." "How small?" She told him the number. It wasn't small at all, not for Daniel, but it was far less than the full registration cost. Still, it might as well have been a mountain. "I'll set aside some trade credit for you," Grace said before he could object. "Consider it a loan. Pay me back whenever you can." Daniel opened his mouth to refuse, but Grace raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not doing this out of pity," she said firmly. "I'm doing this because those three creatures trust you more than anything else in this world, and that kind of trust doesn't come from someone who doesn't deserve it. Let me help." Daniel swallowed hard, throat tight, and finally nodded. "Thank you, Grace, I mean it." "Just don't get yourself killed climbing through more wreckage," she replied. "I'd rather you stayed poor and alive than rich and dead." Over the following days, with Grace's help, Daniel began the slow process of filing registration paperwork for Rocky, Sunny, and Willow. It was tedious, filled with confusing forms and long waiting periods, but for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a small flicker of hope. That hope was interrupted one evening when Rocky, startled by a loud noise outside, let out a burst of fire far larger than anything he had produced before, scorching a black mark across the outer wall of Daniel's home and setting off a small alarm in the colony's public safety system. Within minutes, colony security drones arrived outside, scanning the area, alerted by the heat signature and smoke. Daniel rushed outside, heart pounding, trying to explain the situation to the confused officers, while behind him, Rocky peeked nervously from the doorway, smoke still curling from his nostrils, and Sunny and Willow pressed close together in worry. It was a small incident, quickly resolved with a warning and a fine Daniel could not really afford, but it drew far more attention than he wanted. Word spread quickly through the colony that the poor scavenger in the Eastern District was secretly raising dragonkin. Far from Outpost Dre 9, in a private ship docked at a much wealthier station, a man named Victor Kane received the news with great interest. He set down his drink, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Dragonkin," he said softly, "raised by a broke scavenger who can barely feed himself. That's almost too easy." He turned to the figure standing near the door, the same stranger in the gray coat who had been watching Daniel for weeks. "Get me everything on this Daniel Reyes," Kane said, "and prepare an offer. Every poor man has a price, and I intend to find his." A week after the fire alarm incident, a sleek black shuttle landed just outside Outpost Dre 9's main gate, far nicer than anything the colony usually saw. Word spread fast among the locals, curious about the visitor who stepped out wearing clothes worth more than most of the colony's yearly income combined. Victor Kane walked through the dusty streets of the colony like he owned them, his gray-coated assistant following close behind. He asked a few polite questions at the trading post, offered a generous tip for information, and within an hour, he was standing outside Daniel's small patched-up home. Daniel was outside repairing a crack in the outer wall when he noticed the two strangers approaching. Rocky, lounging nearby in a patch of sunlight, lifted his head immediately, a low growl building in his throat. Sunny peeked curiously from the doorway, while Willow stayed hidden further inside, watching cautiously. "Daniel Reyes?" Kane asked smoothly, extending a hand that Daniel did not shake. "Depends who's asking," Daniel replied, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Kane smiled, unbothered. "My name is Victor Kane. I've traveled quite far because I heard something interesting. A poor scavenger, struggling to make ends meet, somehow ended up raising 3 dragonkin hatchlings. That's a remarkable story. Daniel's jaw tightened. They're not for sale if that's what you're here for. Everything is for sale, Kane said simply, glancing past Daniel toward the doorway, where Rocky now stood protectively, wings half spread. I'm prepared to offer you an amount of credits that would completely change your life. No more scavenging through dangerous wreckage. No more skipping meals. A real home, real security, more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. For a brief moment, Daniel hesitated. He thought of the collapsed cargo hauler, of the near fall that could have ended his life, of the sleepless nights worrying about food. The offer was tempting in a way that made his chest ache. Then he thought of Rocky proudly bringing him bent bolts like treasure, of Sonny quietly rearranging his tools just to help, of Willow pressing close against him after a hard day, humming softly, trusting him completely. No, Daniel said firmly. Kane's smile faded slightly, replaced by something colder. You misunderstand. This isn't really a request, Mr. Reyes. Dragonkin this young, unregistered, living with someone who cannot properly provide for them. That's a legal gray area I could exploit very easily if I wanted to. They are registered, Daniel said, though the paperwork was still incomplete, a fact he hoped Kane didn't know. Kane studied him for a long moment, clearly unsure whether to believe him, before finally stepping back. Think about my offer, Mr. Reyes. I'll be staying in the system for a while. I do hope you make the smart choice. He turned and walked away, his assistant following silently behind him. That evening, colony authority officers arrived at Daniel's door, informing him that a complaint had been filed regarding unregistered dangerous alien species living within civilian housing. Daniel suspected immediately who was behind it. You have 2 weeks to complete registration, the officer told him, not unkindly, or the creatures will need to be surrendered to colony custody. Daniel felt the floor drop out from under him. 2 weeks. The registration fee alone was more than he could realistically earn in that time, especially while still trying to feed 3 growing dragons. That night he sat outside his home, staring up at the stars, utterly exhausted. Rocky, Sonny, and Willow curled around him quietly, sensing something was wrong even if they didn't fully understand what. Grace found him there an hour later, having heard about the visit from Kane through the colony's fast-moving gossip network. You didn't sell them, she said, sitting down beside him. Of course not, Daniel replied quietly. Grace nodded, unsurprised. Good. Kane's the kind of man who thinks everything and everyone has a price. People like that don't understand people like you. People like Kane also don't take rejection well, Daniel muttered. I have a bad feeling about this. Grace was quiet for a moment before speaking again. I talked to some others in the colony, people who have seen how you care for these 3. A few of us want to help you raise the registration fee. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible either. Over the following days, word quietly spread through Outpost Dre 9. A handful of colonists, moved by the story of the poor scavenger who had risked everything for 3 orphan dragonkin, began offering small amounts of credit, extra work, spare supplies, anything they could afford to give. It wasn't much individually, but together it started to add up. Daniel worked harder than ever, taking every job he could find, while Rocky, Sonny, and Willow, now old enough to understand something serious was happening, tried in their own clumsy ways to help, guarding the home at night, helping carry supplies, staying close to Daniel whenever strangers were near. Meanwhile, aboard his private shuttle, Victor Kane watched the growing community support around Daniel with quiet irritation. He's turning this into a public sympathy story, Kane muttered, swirling his drink. Fine. If the legal path is getting complicated, we'll simplify things. He turned to his assistant. Contact the mercenary group we used on the Outer Rim job. I want those 3 dragonkin removed from that habitat within the week. Quietly, if possible, forcefully, if necessary. The assistant nodded and stepped away to make the call. Back at his small patched-up home, unaware of the storm quietly gathering against him, Daniel sat with Rocky, Sunny, and Willow curled protectively around him, and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to feel a small, fragile sense of hope. He did not yet know that hope would be tested far sooner and far more violently than he expected. The power flickered out across the eastern scrap district a little past midnight, and Daniel woke instantly, some old survival instinct telling him something was wrong before his mind fully caught up. The colony's backup lights should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. Rocky was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest, eyes fixed on the door. Sunny had gone very still, head tilted, clearly listening to something Daniel couldn't hear yet. Willow pressed close against his leg, trembling slightly. "Stay behind me," Daniel whispered, grabbing the heavy metal pipe he kept by the door for emergencies. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all he had. The door burst open a moment later, kicked in by a figure in dark tactical gear, followed quickly by two more. Their faces were hidden behind visored helmets, weapons raised, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of job many times before. "Grab the targets," one of them barked, "non-lethal on the human unless he resists." Rocky didn't wait for an order. He lunged forward with a furious roar, far louder and fiercer than anything Daniel had heard from him before, slamming into the closest mercenary and sending him crashing into the wall. Sunny darted low and fast, weaving between legs, using her smaller size and cleverness to knock over supply crates and create chaos, buying precious seconds. "Get out through the back," Daniel shouted at Willow, pushing her gently toward the small rear exit. But Willow, shy, gentle Willow, who had spent months hiding behind Daniel's legs at the smallest sign of trouble, did something no one expected. She planted her feet firmly, faced the mercenary raising a weapon toward Daniel, and let out a burst of golden fire unlike anything she had ever produced before, forcing the attacker back with a startled shout. Outside, the commotion had already drawn attention. Rusty, Daniel's old battered drone, activated its emergency alarm at full volume, a piercing sound that echoed across the entire scrap district, waking nearby colonists. Daniel swung his pipe hard, catching one mercenary across the arm as the man tried to grab Willow, forcing him to drop his weapon with a pained shout. Rocky, seeing his sibling threatened, charged again, this time managing to pin the man against the broken wall with sheer force and fury. The fight spilled out of the small home and into the narrow street outside, metal and fire and shouting filling the night air. More mercenaries emerged from a hidden transport parked nearby, at least 5 more joining the chaos. Daniel's heart pounded as he fought to stay between the attackers and his 3 dragons, exhaustion and fear mixing together as he took a hard hit to the shoulder from a stun baton, staggering but refusing to fall. Then lights began flooding into the street. Grace arrived first, armed with an old but functional plasma cutter she used for trade post repairs, shouting for other colonists to help. Word had spread fast once Rusty's alarm went off, and within minutes, a dozen colonists poured out of their homes, armed with whatever tools and makeshift weapons they had. "Get away from him," Grace shouted, firing a warning shot that scorched the ground near one of the mercenaries. The tide of the fight began to shift. Rocky, Sunny, and Willow fighting fiercely alongside Daniel and now backed by an entire angry community. Proved far too much for Kane's hired mercenaries to handle. Colony security drones, finally alerted by the growing disturbance, arrived moments later, quickly moving to subdue the remaining attackers. Victor Kane, watching the entire operation fail from a secure feed aboard his shuttle, slammed his drink down in fury. "Pull them out," he snapped at his assistant, "now before colony security traces this back to us." But it was already too late. One of the captured mercenaries, desperate to avoid full responsibility, quickly gave up details about who had hired them, providing colony security with more than enough evidence linking the attack directly to Victor Kane. By the time the chaos finally settled, the street outside Daniel's home was filled with colonists, security officers, and the smoking remains of the failed raid. Daniel sat exhausted on the ground, his shoulder aching badly as Rocky, Sunny, and Willow gathered close around him, still tense, still protective, refusing to leave his side even as medics tried to check on him. Willow, trembling from the aftermath of using so much fire at once, pressed her head gently against Daniel's chest, letting out a soft, worried hum. Rocky nudged Daniel's uninjured shoulder repeatedly, as if checking he was still there. Sunny simply curled up tightly against his side, watching the surrounding chaos with sharp, wary eyes. "I'm okay," Daniel murmured, wrapping one arm around as many of them as he could reach. "We're okay, all of us." Grace knelt down beside him, offering a tired but relieved smile. "You've got some very loyal family there, Daniel." Daniel looked at the three dragons pressed close around him, exhausted but fiercely protective, and felt something warm settle deep in his chest, despite the pain in his shoulder. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I guess I do." Colony security officers moved through the wreckage of the failed raid, collecting evidence and arresting the remaining mercenaries, while news of the attack and the incredible way three young dragonkin had fought fiercely to protect their poor human guardian began spreading quickly through Outpost Dre 9 and beyond. Far away aboard his shuttle, Victor Kane watched security forces close in on his location, his carefully built plan collapsing entirely. For the first time in a long while, the wealthy collector found himself completely out of options and completely out of luck. News traveled fast after the failed raid, and by the following morning, nearly everyone in Outpost Dre 9 knew the story of the poor scavenger and the three young dragonkin who had fought so fiercely to protect him. Colony security had confirmed Victor Kane's involvement, and reports of his arrest reached the colony within days, along with confirmation that his assets would be used to compensate the damages he had caused. Daniel spent the next few days resting, his shoulder wrapped tightly, while Rocky, Sunny, and Willow rarely left his side, watching over him with the same fierce protectiveness they had shown during the fight. Even simple things, like Daniel getting up to make food, were met with worried chirps and careful nudges, as if they were afraid something else might happen to him. The Colony Trade Council, moved by the events and the growing public support for Daniel, agreed to waive the remaining registration fees entirely, officially recognizing Rocky, Sunny, and Willow as registered residents of Outpost Dre 9. Grace personally handled the paperwork this time, refusing to let Daniel worry about a single form. "You've done enough worrying for one lifetime," she told him firmly, setting the completed documents on his table. "Let someone else handle the boring parts for once." Daniel managed a tired smile. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, Grace." "You can repay me by not almost dying next time," she replied simply. "Deal." "Deal," Daniel agreed. As the days passed, the three dragons continued to grow, both in size and understanding. One evening, as Daniel sat outside repairing a small section of his roof, now finally able to afford real materials thanks to donations from grateful colonists, Sunny climbed up beside him, watching curiously as he worked. "You know," Daniel said quietly, mostly to himself, "I was never actually rich. Not once, not before you three showed up, and not really now either." Sunny tilted her head, clearly listening. "I just didn't have the heart to leave 3 eggs out in the cold," he continued. "Turns out that decision nearly got me killed a few times over." Rocky, lounging nearby in a warm patch of sunlight, let out a low, amused huff, as though he found the whole situation entirely reasonable. Willow, who had grown noticeably braver since the night of the raid, climbed up onto the roof as well, settling close beside Daniel, golden scales catching the evening light beautifully. "We don't care," a soft voice said suddenly, startling Daniel badly enough that he nearly dropped his tools. He turned to see Willow watching him steadily, her voice small but clear, the first real words any of them had managed to speak. "You don't what?" Daniel asked, stunned. "We don't care," Willow repeated softly, "that you don't have credits. You gave us warmth, safety, love, that's rich enough." Rocky and Sunny both made soft sounds of agreement, and Daniel realized, with growing amazement, that his three dragons had been quietly learning to speak for longer than he had known. He sat there for a long moment, completely speechless, before finally laughing, a genuine, warm laugh that felt like it released weeks of built-up stress all at once. "You three," he said, shaking his head, "have absolutely no idea how poor I actually am." "Doesn't matter," Rocky rumbled, his voice deep and a little rough from disuse. "You're still the richest human we know." Word of the talking dragonkin, combined with the earlier story of their fierce loyalty during the raid, spread even further across the sector in the following weeks. Traders, curious travelers, and even a few respectful representatives from dragonkin communities on distant worlds began reaching out, eager to meet the human who had raised 3 hatchlings not for profit, but purely out of kindness. Slowly, surprisingly, Daniel's fortunes began to shift. Grateful trade offers, respectful gifts from visiting dragonkin elders honoring the care given to their young, and steady work opportunities from colonists who had come to deeply respect him all began to add up. It wasn't overnight wealth, and Daniel remained, at heart, the same practical, hard-working scavenger he had always been. But slowly, his patched-up home became a proper home. The heater finally worked without flickering. The roof no longer leaked. The pantry was never empty again. Grace visited often, gradually becoming less of a helpful friend and more of a steady, constant presence in Daniel's life, something he found himself deeply grateful for, even if neither of them rushed to put a name to it. Rusty, upgraded thanks to a few generous parts donations, buzzed around happily, finally free of its constant flickering and broken arm, proudly following Rocky, Sunny, and Willow wherever they went, still convinced, in its own small robotic way, that it was their brave guardian. One quiet evening, months later, Daniel stood outside his home, watching the sun set over Outpost Dre 9, Rocky, Sunny, and Willow, now young dragons rather than hatchlings, resting peacefully nearby, wings folded, scales glowing softly in the fading light. He thought back to that first night, kneeling beside a broken pod in the Badlands, 3 warm eggs in his hands, and the simple choice he had made without fully understanding what it would lead to. He had never been rich, not in the way Kane or the wealthy traders understood it. He still counted his credits carefully. He still worked hard every single day. But watching his 3 dragons rest peacefully nearby, trusting him completely, loving him without condition, Daniel finally understood exactly what they had seen in him from the very beginning. Not credits, not luxury, not power. Just warmth, safety, and love, freely given, even when he had almost nothing else to offer. And in the end, that had turned out to be the greatest fortune of all.